Good afternoon and welcome everybody to another NAHT Discovery Education Pathway webinar with the brilliant Guy Dudley, Head of Advice at the NAHT, and we have some other special guests to join us as well today from the NAHT, which I'm really looking forward to introducing to you in meeting for another one of our advice for the current times discussion. These have become an absolute godsend actually for many of us leaders, and I can say us leaders. I'm a school leader again, still working very much with Discovery Education NAHT, but proud to be a school head teacher again. So these advice for the current times webinars have become particularly poignant and relevant for me, and it's a proud privilege of mine to be able to sit down with the likes of Guy and his team and talk to you about what's on our minds at the moment as school leaders and senior leaders. We will be mentioning briefly the Pathway Programme. You know the school, you know how it works. We will possibly be mentioning a few different advice pieces that appear in the most brilliant advice hub that kind of underpins a lot of the Pathway Programme, which, as you'll know, is an online programme of CPD courses, a huge suite of different professional development courses designed to empower you and motivate you and help you monitor your health and well-being and your professional knowledge. But before we get to all of that, you will hear us mention the word Pathway. So if you want to find out more, check out the URL there. I'm sure my colleague Bobby, who's always on it, will have already shared it in the chat. And also, if you want to join the discussion on social media, we tend to use #TheWholeTeacher because, as you know, our campaign is always very much underpinned by our mantra: self-care is not a self-indulgence, it's a duty when you're in education. So we need to look after ourselves, and particularly at the moment, as we come to the end of what has been a most challenging term, has it not, with a little bit more uncertainty and lack of clarity on the horizon as well. So we'll try and sort out some of that for you. So lots of issues to knock over, lots of important pieces to talk about. And we're joined by the very best. So we have, of course, Guy Dudley, who'll be very well known to many of you who joined in a lot of these webinars over the last few months. Lead author of the Advice Hub within the Pathway Programme at the NAHT, and James Bowen, Director of Policy at the NAHT, and Sarah Hannafin from NAHT as well, Senior Policy Advisor. So we are really in good company, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be sitting down and listening to their very latest advice to help us, as Guy would say, stay in control, to help give us our control back again. So a big welcome to you, James, to Guy, and to Sarah. A big agenda coming up today. So before I hand over to Guy, let's have a quick look at what we're hoping to knock over today. Some big ones here. Ofsted will look at the implications of Ofsted's recent announcement that it will be accelerating its inspection timetable, as well as discussing Ofsted's overall approach to inspections in the coming months, so with some very latest changes and updates that we'll be sharing today. Primary statutory assessment. We'll look at the government's approach to primary assessment and performance data this academic year and consider the concerns that are being raised by school leaders like ourselves. Secondary qualifications, we'll consider the decisions around exams and the contingency arrangements for 2022, as well as the issues around performance data. And then we'll close with school funding, and we'll examine the government's latest school funding announcements and consider what this will mean for schools in the coming years. My goodness me, what an agenda, but hey, what a year. And nothing changes as rapidly as advice for schools, particularly in this country. So we're trying to stay ahead, and we're joined by the people who have their finger on the pulse. So I'm going to hand over to you, Guy, to again, to welcome our guests and to get this important discussion flowing. Before I do, just to say, you know that your questions, those of you on the audience, on the call, are always welcome. We do like it when it's a dialogue, when it's a discussion. We don't like one-way soliloquies. We do like to have discussions. And you know I'll keep my eye out very closely on the chat stream and also on the Q&A button to see if anybody does have some questions. And as they're relevant, as they come up, I will actually be posing them to our brilliant speakers. Right, and we hope to aim to finish by about 4:45, but if we run over a little bit, I'm sure you'll help us with that, and I'm sure you'll be patient, but we'll have a lot of issues to get to. So without further ado, why don't I stop sharing, and I'm going to hand over to you, Guy, to continue, and welcome again.
Lovely, thank you, Andrew, and welcome everybody. And as Andrew said, you know, recent announcement, gosh, there's been some announcements today at 8 o'clock this morning by government departments and Ofsted, and I'll let James touch on those in his session. I just wanted to say I'm really delighted to be joined by a couple of colleagues today. Some of you may know them or come across them: James Bowen, Director of Policy, and Sarah Hannafin, one of our senior advisors in the policy team. And we had thought of doing a different type of webinar today, but I think the decision, last minute decision to change track was the right one, because I think with recent announcements on Ofsted assessment and funding, we couldn't really let the year go by without covering these three. And I hope you'll find it's an enjoyable session. I did want to sort of mention two quick points. Most of what we discussed today will be in a paper put together by me. It's 8 or 9 pages long, and it pretty much covers everything we're going to talk about today, apart from the announcements today, because I finished writing it slightly before the 8 o'clock announcement this morning. But there will be a paper, and that will be emailed out to everybody who's registered for this webinar. So there will be a paper coming out to you and for you. And also just really put a health warning with this. What James and Sarah are going to talk about today and what we're going to discuss is very much contemporaneous, and it's changing almost by the day. And as I said, some fairly significant announcements were made at 8 o'clock this morning. Some were made yesterday and some last week. James and Sarah no doubt will touch on those, especially James with Ofsted. But I just wanted to say, naturally, what we're going to touch on today is what we know today. So, bear with us. What we'd like to do, if at all possible, and James and Sarah are in agreement, is come back and probably do another one of these next year at some appropriate moment when we can bring you up to date with even more detail around the inspection frameworks, assessment and funding. So that was just a quick health warning from me that James and Sarah don't work for Ofqual or Ofsted. They do work for the NAHT with me. I can verify that. And what they do know, they're very good at knowing, but they're human. They know what they know today. And boy, they'll probably have a good guess what's happening tomorrow. But James, I'll let you expand upon that health warning.
Thank you, Guy, and thanks for confirming that I certainly don't work for Ofsted. That is 100% true. Lovely to be with you this afternoon, and thank you for joining us on what I'm sure would have been another hugely busy day, particularly in light of the announcement, the Prime Minister's announcement last night. It would have been, I'm sure, another hugely demanding day. So I'm going to start off talking about everybody's favorite subject, Ofsted, and I'm going to break that into two parts. I'm going to talk firstly about the sort of current and immediate situation and the pressures that are on schools, and I'm going to look particularly at the issue of deferrals as well as what we know from the announcement this morning, and then I want to look at the announcement that was made by Ofsted a few weeks ago, and that was regarding the changes they're making to their inspection timetable and the implications there for schools and how that might affect you in your school. Before I get into those sort of details though, let's reflect briefly on the impact of the Prime Minister's announcement last night for Ofsted and the news we got this morning. So I'm sure many of you would have seen this already. The DfE has now confirmed that Ofsted will be suspending inspections for next week, unless of course serious safeguarding concerns are raised. So no inspections next week. We also know that they won't be inspecting the first week back in January. That had already been announced. That was to take account of schools having to get used to the new sort of testing arrangements that are being in place. Now, I'll be very honest with you, our view is that this should have happened weeks ago. We've been putting pressure on Ofsted for a number of weeks, if not months now, to be honest with you, that they should be halting their routine inspection. I think for us, it's become abundantly clear that Ofsted is causing enormous pressure and frankly unnecessary stress for schools at a time when they are still right in the middle of dealing with all the consequences of the pandemic. We know that things haven't gone away. We know it's not business as usual. It couldn't be further from that. And we think that Ofsted trying to just return to routine inspections was completely the wrong thing to do and an unhelpful distraction. So just to be clear, we know that the inspections are paused for next week and the first week back, but we will be pushing for that to be extended into the new year because I think we're all expecting the disruption to continue for some time soon. And beyond that, actually, at NHT, we think there needs to be a proper conversation now about how inspections can return in a fair and proportionate manner and in a way that properly takes into account the impact of the pandemic. From what we've seen so far this term, as inspections have come back, certainly some schools have had positive experiences, and I would be lying if I said they weren't all positive, if they weren't all negative even, but we have had concerns from some schools where it seemed like the inspection team just hasn't properly been taking the impact of the pandemic into account and not really listening to school leaders when they're trying to explain the consequences and the impact on their school. So we do think there needs to be a serious conversation about whether or not the existing framework, which of course was written pre-pandemic, is still fit for purpose. But of course, we don't yet know exactly what the government will do when it comes to Ofsted next term. So I thought the best thing I could do for you this afternoon, apart from giving you that information, is actually to talk you through some of the advice we've been giving to members at NHT over the last few weeks, which I hope will be helpful to you if and when Ofsted start to inspect again. So let's look at that. I said I'm going to talk in two parts. Let's firstly look at this issue of the kind of the immediate pressure on schools and this issue of deferrals, which I think is an important one. So prior to the latest announcement, we met with senior Ofsted officials last week. As a result of that and the pressure being put on them by others, they did update and review their deferral guidance. What the inspectorate have told us is that they are going to be looking far more sympathetically and with greater understanding on deferral requests from schools, particularly where COVID continues to affect the day-to-day running of your school or the day-to-day operation of your school. We've also been told that over the last couple of weeks, Ofsted are now accepting the vast majority of deferral requests, so that should give people some confidence. And I think what we're saying is that if you do receive the Ofsted call, whenever that is, second, third week of January, if that's the point, but you think, or you know that the current pressures that you're under in your school because of COVID means it would not be the right time for you to be inspected, and you couldn't even get a fair inspection, that you should certainly consider asking for a deferral and giving that really serious consideration. And we're asking people to let us know if they do that. On the paperwork that will come out afterwards, there'll be an email address that you can let us know on. And the reason we want people to do that is because actually we want to hold Ofsted to account. They hold schools to account, but they've told us they're going to take a far more open-minded view to that request for deferrals. So we want people to tell us if they've requested one and what the outcome was, because then we can go back if there are cases where deferrals aren't being granted. We want to know and we want to challenge, and frankly we won't hesitate to sort of step in and take action to support people if Ofsted aren't being good to their word on that one. Now, if you do get to a stage where you think a deferral would be right for your school, I think the key piece of advice that I would give you is that it's so important that you make that request as early as possible in the very, very first phone call you have. That's crucial. But secondly, that when you do so, that you explain very clearly how COVID is affecting the day-to-day operation and the functioning of your school. So now some people have said, oh, can you give us a template, or can you give us a sort of script that we can use? Actually, I think that will probably do more harm than good, because if you say to us that, oh, we don't want you coming in at the moment because of COVID, they probably won't look on that too favorably. It needs to be very specific to your school. So for example, I've got 2 or 3 of my key stage 1 teachers off at the moment. Half our SOT are covering classes. I'm in class with, we can't have an inspection at the moment. That's far more likely to be successful. And that's why we wouldn't sort of give a generic template. And again, if you experience any issues, we would like to hear about that. What I would say, though, of course, we're acutely aware that deferral doesn't solve everything. A deferral sort of kicks the can down the road for a little bit, but there are sort of bigger issues at play, as I've alluded to already, the kind of more pernicious ongoing effects of inspection, if you like. And at NHT, we will continue to campaign for real fundamental reform of inspection in this country, because actually our view is that the vast majority of school leaders totally understand and accept the need for accountability, but we think there are fundamental issues with the current approach to inspection that do more harm than good. And to support us in that, there's something else we're asking people to do if you have the time, and I know you're incredibly busy, so you may not, but if you do, we'd like you to tell us about the impact that inspections had on your school, or even the potential kind of impending inspection, because we know often one of the things that creates a lot of pressure in schools isn't actually the inspection itself, but it's that not knowing that they could turn up any day. And I think in the middle of a pandemic, that's been exacerbated. So again, please do email us, give us that first-hand experience, because often we're accused of Ofsted of sort of exaggerating. They say, oh, it's not so bad. Actually, people quite like inspection. And we need those first-hand accounts where we can say, look, this is the impact that sort of routine inspection still taking place is having on schools at the moment. So that's the deferral side. I just want to look a bit more closely now at the second part, which was Ofsted's announcement a few weeks ago that it would be accelerating its inspection timetable. Now, the first thing I probably need to say that it's going to be incredibly hard in this sort of format for me to give you precise timescales for every different scenario that schools might find themselves in. So I'm afraid I can't sort of get out my crystal ball and tell you the exact day and week that you could expect to be re-inspected. It would depend a lot on your previous grade, whether you're a new school, existing school. But actually what I would strongly recommend you do, if you haven't already done so, is cast your eyes over a recent Ofsted blog. Again, we'll put this in the notes. It came out a couple of weeks ago, and it gives a lot of detail about when schools might be able to expect an inspection, roughly speaking. So it's well worth reading that because it breaks it down depending on whether you're a school that was good before, outstanding, RI, things like that. So I'd have a good look at that. But to unpick it a little bit, the first thing we know is that despite the announcement, actually there will be no changes in terms of accelerating the timetable this year. Frankly, they haven't got enough inspectors yet to do that. They'll have to spend this year trying to recruit more. So the current timetable for inspection this year will remain unchanged. And what Ofsted tell us at the moment is that they are currently focusing on schools that were last inspected in 2016 and 17. Certainly if you got a good last time. Slightly different, of course, if you're an outstanding school. There's a different timetable there. And again, I would have a good look at that blog. Similar if you're in a category, again, check out that blog. But the vast majority of inspections this year are going to be focused on those good schools last inspected in 2016-17. Now, those changes, if we look a bit more about what they mean, in simple terms, the government has given Ofsted some more money to speed up its inspection timetable. Now, prior to the pandemic, most schools that had that good school rating could be expected to get an inspection about once every 4 years. As always, they'll never tell you to the exact week, but once every 4 years was roughly what you were expecting. Now, as a result of the pandemic, they are currently running about 5 to 6 terms behind. So in simple terms, you kind of say, well, when was I expecting it before the pandemic? Add on 2 years, add on 5 to 6 terms, and that's roughly what I'd expect now. What these changes mean is that that delay will begin to get shorter over time. So at the moment, it's about a 2-year delay, but they think over the next few years, that 2-year delay will decrease and become more like a 1-year delay. So rather than it being a 5 to 6 term delay, looking more like 3 to 4 terms. Important to point out, it doesn't mean schools would get inspected sooner than they would have done pre-pandemic. There is still a delay. So Ofsted, even with this, will still be running behind. And by 2025, they still think they'll be running about a year behind. And of course, if you're a school that was rated last time, when you are inspected, the vast majority can expect to receive what they call a Section 8 ungraded inspection, that one where they sort of come in, what we used to call short inspection, although it's not so short now, but it's that to check that the school is still good. That is, of course, unless a risk assessment flags up the need to go straight to what they call the full fat Section 5 inspection. So obviously we haven't got long, and I know we're pressed for time. So there's 3 things I'd finish on in summary with Ofsted. If you're sort of thinking about Ofsted, 3 things I would recommend you do. Number 1, read that Ofsted blog I mentioned. And I know you probably don't want to spend your time reading Ofsted blogs, and I wouldn't normally recommend it, but this one is well worth reading if you want to get a sense of the timescales. We'll put it in the notes, but if you literally Google Ofsted blogs, it will come out as the very top one. So read that blog. The second thing I'd say is NHT have our own advice on this, and we've updated that in the last 24 hours. So that's very live advice. And I know Guy will be making sure that's on our Pathways advice hub. So do look at our advice, because gives you lots of information about how to handle that initial call, things we've learned from our members going through inspections. And then the third thing I would say is, if you are a member of NHT, please do contact us. If you request a deferral, let us know if you've got it. Also, let us know if you're having any problems. Since full inspection came back, we've been working with lots of NHT members to support them through their inspections, to make sure that they get the best possible outcome, and to push back. If we've had examples where inspectors aren't taking the pandemic into account, we've given them support to challenge that and push back. So that's a whistle-stop tour of where we are with Ofsted. I'll pause and take a breath there, because I don't know if this is the point, Guy, we might want to ask a bit more about that, but I know we're pushed for time as well.
A couple of very quick questions
on there. Yeah.
Do you think, are you happy with that, Guy? We'll just do a quick, two quick ones.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much for that, James. That was so informative and so quick, so delivered so much information in such a short space of time. Thank you. Really, really appreciated it. Yeah, so the first one that came in a little earlier on actually was from Sue Harrett. She just wants confirmation of, when you're talking about January, do you mean as in the deferring to January, do you mean it's the first full week back in January, or the part week when schools return midweek?
So I think it's the first full week back. Yeah. I should double check that. I know that this was an announcement a few weeks ago that said, I mean, of course, the slight challenge is not all schools go back on the same day, right? So exactly. I will double check that. And again, that is on the Ofsted website. But the point of that announcement at the time was saying, look, it was more to do with the fact they were asking secondary schools to set up these on-site testing again. So they're setting up the on-site testing sites. That means you need a week, to deal with that. So I'm pretty sure it's the first full week. I've just seen someone said HMI told them 10th of January, which does ring a bell. So I think that confirms what I was saying. Double check the Ofsted website. I think it's the full week.
Thank you. And then Andrew Simpson, thank you, Andrew, is asked, please can you give is it possible to give a link to the article that you mentioned, which suggests when the next inspection was?
Yes, absolutely. And I'll find a way of doing that. But if I can't, if you Google Ofsted blogs, the very first they've got a page for blogs, and it's a blog by their national director, a guy called Chris Russell. And it is the very first blog. Now, as I say, I don't want to overpromise. This blog doesn't say your next inspection will be the 28th of May 2000. No. I wish it did. I wish I could come with that kind of crystal, but it gives you a good sense, I think, and it breaks it down into each category of school in terms of your last Ofsted rating. It gives a bit of clarity, even if you're a new school. There is one thing we are chasing them on in that blog. There's one thing which I don't think is quite as clear as it could be when it talks about RI schools. RI schools normally have to wait 30 months, 30 months for the next sort of full re-inspection. In that blog, it talks about them still being 2 years behind. So the sort of 2 years add 2.5 years, 4.5 years. We think it's still 4.5 years, and I think that's what that blog says. We've put in a query into them just to double check, because you could read that two ways.
Brilliant, thank you. And then one tiny quick one before we move on to Sarah. A quick question: if you were RI or academised because of inadequate, are those schools still being targeted first?
So yes, if you're in a category, so if you've got the RI or inadequate, you are still likely to get. So those schools already got their inspections sooner than good and outstanding schools, and so they will stick to that kind of seeing those schools sooner. So in simple terms, if you're in a category before, yes, they are still trying to see those schools earlier, so they will be prioritised.
And Phil, who very kindly posted his question in the actual Q&A, so I mustn't ignore it. Thank you, Phil. It's Phil's understanding that from both the framework and a recent directive from Ofsted that inspectors must take account of the impact of the pandemic on their school community. Am I correct? I know a couple of recent instances where inspectors have told the schools that they will not take account. But you did say they would, wouldn't they? So they absolutely should. The problem we've got, though, is that is a subjective statement, isn't it? It must take account of the pandemic. So I think the problem, so yes, they absolutely should. And if you've got an inspector who says, I don't want to talk about the pandemic at all, I'm not interested, let's pretend it didn't happen, I would strongly urge you to get on the phone to Ofsted and complain to the duty desk and say, this is not right. If we've had a few instances.
I think sometimes what happens, you do get a bit of kind of a few instances suddenly sound like they're thousands and thousands. I'm not sure we're getting that number, but we are getting a few instances of inspectors sort of apparently saying COVID's in the rear view mirror. I'm not talking about, I mean, they're going to struggle to do that after last night's press
I think they
conference.
are.
But if you do get that, you absolutely should get on, because it is in there. I don't think it's in the handbook doesn't say absolutely explicit, you must take account of COVID, but there's enough forms of words in there that we should be able to lean on and say, look, of course you should. I spoke to one of the Ofsted senior officials recently. They used a phrase which I didn't like. They said, oh, what we're saying to inspectors is that the pandemic shouldn't be an excuse, but it's certainly a factor. Now, I think the problem with that is it depends which way you lean, doesn't it? Because the inspector might say, well, it's not an excuse. Another inspector might say, well, it is a factor. The bottom line is they absolutely should be considering it. They should absolutely taking it on board. Correct. And if you don't think they are, absolutely feel confident in phoning up the duty line and say, look, we've got an inspector here who's not being reasonable.
Thank you. Absolutely right. Thank you so much, James. Guy, over to you. Thank you, James.
Thank you, James. That was great. And I just wanted to add for viewers or listeners that the link to the blog that James referred to is in the notes. So it is there. If you can't find it, it is there. So you'll get that electronically shortly after this webinar.
Fantastic. Thank you, Guy.
I think that's everything in the Q&A and on the chat.
That's it. That's what I have for now.
So I'm really pleased to hand over to my colleague now, Sarah Hannafin, who's going to take us a walk through primary assessment, or it might be a sort of dredge through primary assessment and the picture on sort of secondary as well. But let's start with primary, Sarah. Over to you.
Thank you, Guy. Good afternoon, everyone. It's really great to be here, and just to echo my thanks for all of you joining us in what's a hugely busy and very pressured period at the moment. So thank you. I'm going to start by talking about primary assessment and performance data, bit of a whistle-stop tour really of where we're at, where the government's at, and some of the concerns that we're still raising consistently with the Department for Education. Just to sort of set out our position at the outset, a resolution was passed at conference in October, and that was that primary statutory assessment should not go ahead this year, and we'll continue to campaign and argue on that basis. I think the other thing I'd like to say is we've been so ahead of the curve from DFE. I think there have been slow reactions, there's a lack of proactivity, late decision making, there's slow sign-off processes. It means we've always been one step ahead in terms of trying to push the DFE to make decisions that we can see coming and that our members are asking for the information for. So it was quite near the start of last academic year when we started trying to push DFE to think about 2022 and the plans for primary statutory assessment, and ultimately pushing them to take a proportionate approach. And we continue that push now. So formal letters, we have meetings, informal conversations, whether that's with ministers, senior officials, the Standards and Testing Agency. So those things are just consistent. And I think some of the key things we've pressed on members' behalf, the significant changes that came in 2020 in September for statutory assessment. So we had the reception baseline, changes to the early years foundation stage profile, the engagement model, and the multiplication tables check. So all of those things were coming in this academic year. We've also pointed out to ministers that that isn't the only stuff that schools are dealing with in terms of new initiatives, the RSHE curriculum, the early career framework, all of those are putting pressure onto schools. What we know is that what schools want to prioritise is teaching and learning, pupil wellbeing and recovery, as well as the ongoing challenges of the pandemic. And yeah, we don't know where we are at the moment, do we? So what we've been saying to government is you need to look at the cumulative impact of all of these things on schools, on school leaders, on their staff, and not introduce all of these changes concurrently when there's a much bigger picture in terms of the pandemic facing schools as well. Despite that, you'll know government announced their intention that primary statutory assessment would go ahead this academic year in full. What they did do, and that's after continued pressure from us, is announce the decision that they wouldn't publish any data from those statutory assessments on performance tables. And while we welcome that, what they are going to do is share that data with schools through ASP, but also share it with Ofsted, with regional schools commissioners, with local authorities. And we're pressing hard against that decision. That our position in the first place was that data shouldn't be published at all. But in terms of any data generated next year, it's not going to be able to be used to make any comparison between schools at all, or between years within the same school, because of the experiences of individual schools, individual pupils. So why share it at all? We continue to make the case for government against statutory assessment this year, and that if they do go ahead, that this data should not be shared. Any comparisons that Ofsted or regional schools commissioners make with that data are going to be clearly unfair and completely unreasonable. Ultimately, we'll just keep pressing away. It's one of those issues that this is where we are at the moment, but our lobbying, our campaigning, our making the case to government doesn't stop. So I'll take a breath there, Guy, bit of a whistle-stop tour.
Sarah, a quick question from me, because it might be in people's thoughts. When do we? And thanks to that, it's a really clear picture of, you know, the government are pressing ahead, and we're sort of obviously pushing back on that. But do we have a sense of when we'll hear some more developments, presumably in the new year now? Or is it uncertain?
I think we're in a big period of uncertainty. I think everything depends at the moment on the pandemic, on where we go with this new variant in terms of what happens in the new year. I think realistically, that's what the government are looking at, and then looking at what disruption that might cause to education or to delivery.
No, that would sound that would be a sensible way forward, isn't it? I think so much has now been taken over by latest sort of pandemic figures and then the new variants and what impact that's going to have on anything else there as well. James, you've appeared as if by magic.
Yeah, I think, you know, the point that Sarah made about how the data is used is so crucial in this. So one of the arguments government put back to us when we're arguing against SATs going ahead said that, well, we need a national picture. We need the SATs results to give us a sense of how the pandemic's really impacted pupils in primary school over the last few years. To which our response is, well, you only need that at a national level, don't you? What you don't need to do, and what you cannot do, and I think Sarah made the point really well, is say school X is performing better than school Y because it's got 5% higher in its SATs results this year. That would clearly be a nonsense, when those results will probably tell you as much about the level of disruption as it would about anything in terms of teaching and learning. So, you know, Sarah is working so hard on this issue of, look, if you do end up going ahead, and, you know, as Sarah said, our argument is they shouldn't, that nobody, yeah, be it an Ofsted inspector, be it a regional schools commissioner, be it anybody, frankly, local authority, should be using that data to kind of hold your school to account, or to talk about performance or performance management, or using it in any kind of, you know, statistical way, because it would just be meaningless to do so. So I think that, you know, there's really two parts, like Sarah's explained so well. You know, actually, that should they go ahead, and if they do go ahead, you know, let's be very sensible about this data, because I think when most people you speak to say the biggest problem with SATs isn't necessarily the tests themselves, it's what government does with the data afterwards. And I think more so than ever, that is particularly acute this year.
Great, thank you very much. Andrew, there doesn't appear to be any further questions on primary in the Q&A or the chat.
No, I was checking actually. I think we could probably move on to the next one unless you have anything else you want to ask.
If you've cleared your throat and come up for air, can I ask you to sort of now take us through a whistle-stop tour of secondary?
Yeah, and secondary
Sarah.
obviously is a lot more complex. I'm going to sort of put a caveat in place right now and say what I'm going to talk about is very focused on general qualifications, so GCSE, AS and A-level. There's a huge amount of guidance and work also going on for the technical and vocational qualifications, but the landscape is huge. There's different categories and different things apply to different types of qualifications in terms of technical and vocational, and there just isn't the time to go through those things there. So I'm just going to focus on general qualifications. And yeah, for the past 2 years, things have been very busy, as I'm sure you will all realise, with secondary. So we've had numerous consultations, requests for comments and feedback as guidance is drafted. So we have really good connections with JCQ, with Ofqual, with the DFE, and they do come to us when they draft guidance and ask for our help, expertise, comments, and then hundreds of meetings with ministers, the qualifications team, Ofqual, the exam boards. It's a huge machine with a lot of different parts in terms of secondary qualifications. So what we've got now, we've basically got, and I don't want to confuse people with the news of the plan B yesterday, but I talk about plan A, which is that exams and assessments go ahead as normal. But we also now do have a plan B, which is the contingency plan should exams be cancelled. So I'm going to just talk briefly about plan A, just to say the government's position absolutely is that they want exams and assessments to go ahead as normal. I think cancelling exams will be a very last resort decision for them. It's up somewhere they really don't want to go unless they really have to. There was a consultation in July about adaptations to exams, and the decisions were published. So DFE and Ofqual published some decisions. So what you have are that for GCSE subjects, there will be some choice of topic or choice of content. That's English literature, history, ancient history, and geography. You've got changes to arrangements for practical activities in the sciences and in art and design. So if you are linked into those subjects, there are some changes there. There's this thing about advanced information. That's probably the biggest adaptation. So this is going to be provided by the exam boards no later than the 7th of February. And it applied to the majority of GCSE, AS and A-level qualifications, but also to core maths and freestanding maths qualifications. That advanced information is going to vary by subject. I'll say a little bit more about that, but there is some guidance from JCQ about it. The other thing that's being put in place for GCSE maths and GCSE physics and combined science. So for maths, there's going to be a formula sheet provided, and for physics and combined science, an equation sheet. So those are the things that they've put in place. From our perspective, obviously, those sorts of adaptations are welcome, but we've been clear that we don't think they go far enough. They don't go far enough to address the very differential impact that the pandemic has had on teaching and learning for individual schools, but also for individual students. So we're really concerned that actually there's not enough there to make things fair. And in particular, the advance notice information, our members weren't happy with the proposals for when it would be published. So we were pushing that it should be published at the beginning of the academic year. And we keep pushing now that it needs to be released as soon as possible. I know the exam boards have got it ready, so there's no reason why it can't be. I think the bone of contention is that the DfE, their policy decision was this advance notice information is to support revision. What they think is going to happen is that the advance notice information will narrow teaching and learning. But I really struggle, and our secondary council really struggle. That argument holds very little strength when you actually look at what the advance information will be. And actually, I think today, some more subject specific detail about what that advance information will cover, will look like, has been published by the exam board. So it's not the advance information itself, but what it does is it's not going to be a list of, the specification content with this is in the exam, this is not. It's much more high level than that. It's mainly focused on high tariff questions. It'll give, some of it gives information on some papers or some sections of some papers, but not others. So to narrow the teaching and learning of the spec using that information isn't going to be very easy. But we know that teachers have lost learning time. Students have lost learning time. In the first year of their courses last year, they lost learning time. And this term has been disrupted with absence. So the argument we've also been making is actually, it does need to have an impact on how teachers plan the use of the time that they've got left, to know where they should focus perhaps more, because they know there's high tariff questions on those areas of the specification, and where perhaps they can do something more like touch. There's only so much teaching time that you have as a teacher, and you can't get it back. However many after school sessions you try to do, you can't get that back. So the advance notice information is, a difficult one. Performance data is another big issue for secondary. So unlike primary, the government have said they will publish Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5 performance measures as far as possible. So we've argued against that from the very start, and our advice, our views were made very clear in the advice that the accountability team put up to ministers, but ministers ignored that advice and said they would publish. However, there's going to be gaps in the measures, particularly at 16 to 18, because there's been a commitment not to use the results from 2020 and 2021, which were, it was teacher assessment that awarded the grades. The accountability team continue to engage with us. We're talking about that. We know if the data is published, there needs to be a lot of caveats around it. Comparisons are going to be unfair. Exactly the same arguments against publishing performance data at Key Stage 4 and post 16 apply to primary. So why the two decisions were different just doesn't make sense. So we carry on fighting on that one. Very quickly on the contingency arrangements, I know time is going on. So we do actually have a plan B should exams be cancelled. You might remember on January the 4th this year, there was an announcement that exams were cancelled, and the Prime Minister made reference to the contingency plan, which was, he suggested was nearly ready. Well, they'd refused to talk about a contingency plan. And the fact that the detail wasn't published until the end of the spring term, I think just shows how well formed that contingency plan was. So we do have a contingency plan. It will be a similar process to that used in 2021, using teacher assessed grades. Guidance has been published now about how to try to make sure that teachers can collect evidence over the coming months. So if exams are cancelled, actually they've got that evidence already. There are ongoing concerns around the contingency arrangements, but it is a live conversation. So feedback from our members is always very welcome. I don't think a day goes by when I don't talk to either at least, whether it's DFE, Ofqual or JCQ, about exams, qualifications, or the contingency plan. So it really is a live discussion, and they do actually really value our feedback and our input. So I'd encourage you, if you've got areas for clarity or questions, do make sure you ask them.
I'd just add to that. I mean, NAHT, I think, consistently punches above its weight. And, you know, we very much have the ear of the examination boards, Ofqual, DFE, number 10. And I know Sarah spends a lot of her day making sure that, you know, that she's got her fingers on the pulses, on the correct pulses. I just underline that, Sarah, by just letting listeners know, Andrew, that the guidance on advanced information that you referred to, Sarah, and the decisions, or sorry, the guidance on evidence to support tags if Plan B goes ahead. Again, the links to all of those documents are in this paper. It does exist. I'm holding it in front of me. That will be available after the webinar. So all those links that Sarah referred to are in that. And I can't see any questions.
Can't see any questions, actually. That was just so informative and helpful, Sarah. It really was. And thanks for all the time you put in to prepare for that. It was hugely appreciated by everybody. I'm sure they were listening intently. Brilliant. And the fact that there aren't many questions is a testament to the detail that both you and James shared. So really appreciate that. And I do hope you can join us again soon. So thank you. Guy, do you want to close off with a few minutes on funding now?
Yes, that was, I don't want to steal James's thunder.
I'm sorry, it's James.
No, that's okay. Yeah. So I'll let James just take that before we sort of round up. So James, on the last few comments.
Thank you. And I know time's running short, so I'm going to do funding in 2 minutes. You know, so let's see what we can cover, like one of those brilliant BBC clips they do at the moment, just 2 minutes. And can I just say thanks to Sarah as well? We are so lucky to have Sarah. There is nothing she doesn't know when it comes to primary and secondary assessment. So hugely lucky to have her. So let's look at funding. I think in a nutshell, I'm gonna bring this right down. What we know from the last budget and the comprehensive spending review is that government will be putting an additional £4.8 billion into core school funding over the next 3 years. And that's on top of the sort of 7.1 billion before. Now, of course, it's so hard to make sense of such enormous numbers when we're talking about 4.8 billion. I think what's important when we break it down, the Chancellor has said that will restore funding, school funding, to the levels we last had in about 2010. So there's two ways of looking at that. Either you look at it as an increase, or you can look at it as a 15-year freeze, depending on your perspective. I think we've certainly pushed back and said, look, we certainly don't think you can be boasting about returning to 2010 levels, but it is additional money. And on top of that, there'll be an additional 1 billion for recovery. 1.7 billion of that comes into school budgets next year. Now, the important point to make is because of the timing of the budget, this will not go into the national funding formula. So our understanding at the moment is that schools will receive their budget in the normal way through the national funding formula, and then they will receive a separate and additional grant. Now, that will be quite helpful, actually, because it will allow us to see on a school-by-school basis how much additional money you're getting as a result of this budget and the comprehensive spending review. As I said, in total, it's 1.7 billion. Understandably, people's concerns, though, are about costs going up next year. We know there are a number of costs schools are facing. So the first thing I'd say, within that 1.7 billion, 300 million is to cover the new national insurance, the social care levy that schools will face. So that is covered in full as part of that 1.7 billion. Government promised they would cover that, and it will be covered. which then leaves you with about 1.4 billion overall. Huge amount of money. But obviously, I think the pressures that people will be worried about is the lifting of the public sector pay cap, which of course we all think is the right thing to do. It's absolutely, ridiculous that teachers had a pay freeze, and it's right to lift the cap. But as a school leader, that puts a pressure on your budget. And we know that nationally, roughly it equates to a 1% pay rise for teachers costs about 250 million. So if we say, let's guess a 2% pay rise, you start talking about 500 million away from that 1.4 billion, but still some money left there as well. But we do know, I think the big pressure on school budgets next year, because the national insurance should be taken care of, will be teacher pay rises. We don't know what they are yet. That's a process that's going on now in terms of the SDRB, but I think that's the one we need to watch carefully. And of course, support staff as well, which won't have such an impact on school budgets, but a pay increase there can have an impact as well. So I think actually there is some good news here. Often, unions are accused of sort of only bringing bad news. I'm not going to say you're all going to be flush with cash and everything's going to be absolutely fine. But there will be additional money coming into school budgets over the next 3 years that we previously, frankly, weren't expecting. So probably not as much as we'd like, but look out for that additional grant, which we think is most likely to hit budgets around spring. I can't be more precise than that. That was a live conversation with the DfE yesterday when they said should be around spring. Obviously, the sooner we can get a sort of precise date on that, we will let people know. I think I'm going to leave it at that because I think that's probably about enough you need to know. I know we're running already over time, but hopefully that's just giving you a quick flavour of what that budget and that comprehensive spending review is likely to mean at a school by school level, whilst without me being able to tell you to the pound how much you're getting, I'm afraid.
Thank you, James.
Interesting. Thank you, James. Really massively interesting. Before I hand over to Guy to sweep up and sum up, interesting comment from Phil, actually, Phil Barnett. Thank you. It may not be the right time to ask this, but has the government ever considered how much extra money schools will have to fork out for energy costs, not just because of price increases, but also the effect of needing to keep the windows and doors open in cold weather? Absolutely, that's true.
Yeah, so we are. We are telling them, you can imagine, that is a case we are making in very strong terms. And we are actually we're going to do a survey where we're trying to get a sense from members of the cost increases. Obviously, it's quite hard to do because until the cost increases come through, we don't know for sure. So we have to do it retrospectively. But yeah, if you've got all your windows open, your heat pumping out, and we know that gas and electricity prices are skyrocketing, we will absolutely be pushing that case. It's a really important point.
It is, yeah. Thank you, James, as ever. Brilliant answers. Great. Guy, I'd like to give you the final word, really.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say, thank you, James.
Yeah,
and
brilliant.
Thank you, Sarah. I think because you've both prepared so thoroughly, I would have expected you to. We've had few questions and we've produced hopefully a really good document that people will be able to get their hands on at the end of that. So thanks. And I hope if we do this again next year, you'll be able to come back and perhaps shed some more light on the information that we've got so far. And of course, lots of the information that we've shared with you, everyone this afternoon, is both on the Pathway Advice Hub, which Andrew's referred to, and if you're a member of the NHT, on the NHT web pages, on the web pages there. So I hope it's been an informative session. I guess in your new role, Andrew, it has been more informative than ever.
I've been scribbling more notes than I've ever scribbled before, to be honest. I've just been writing so much. Brilliant, really helpful.
It's really difficult to cover these four very, very current topics. And as James and Sarah alluded to, I mean, they're changing almost on a daily basis. And for a profession that hasn't had a pay rise this year, my hats go off to you. Is off to you every day of the week. It's a fantastic job that you're doing. Continue to do. We'll be here to continue to support you to do it, partly through some of these webinars.
We've got your back. Absolutely, we've got your back. And with that in mind, actually do check out that link from Bobby, who's very kindly, my colleague shared it in the chat as well. We have been talking a little bit about Pathway, and you can find out so much more about it by following the link. But brilliant. Unless there's anything else from you, Guy, I think that has been a massively helpful hour.
No,
It really has.
Possibly the most useful 55 minutes of people's time this week. But we'll cover it again in the future, I'm sure.
Absolutely. We'll do this again soon after Christmas for a new year, the new year ahead. Let's hope it's a good one.
Thanks for coming, everybody.
Thanks so much, everyone. We'll see you again soon.
See you soon.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.